Welcome to Indus Special. I'm Ejaz Haider. It was the rise of Athens and the fear that this instilled in Sparta that made war inevitable. Thus wrote Thucydides in his history of the Peloponnesian Wars. Structural realists argue that when a rising power threatens to displace a ruling one, the most likely outcome is war. Graham Allison, who runs the Thucydides trap project at Harvard, thinks the trap can be avoided even though the outcome is uncertain. Allison has also penned a book, Destined for War: Can America and China Escape Thucydides' Trap? Statistically, 12 of 16 cases in which a rising power challenged an existing one in the past 500 years ended violently. In 4 of the 16 cases, including 3 from the 20th century, imaginative statecraft averted war. China and the US aren't about to go to war, but Sino-US relations are certainly marred by growing tensions. Both are waging a trade war already. China's latest white paper on defense contains warnings for US and its allies. US national security strategy talks about containing China. So yes, things aren't hunky-dory, though the nature of any potential conflict in the future cannot be predicted. In the Middle East, since President Donald Trump walked out of the multilateral nuclear deal with Iran, tensions have been rising, with Tehran digging in even as the US has slapped a host of primary and secondary sanctions targeting Iran's economy and trade potential. To discuss the US approach to China and Iran, and we're going to go in the reverse order, we're joined by Mr. Khoshcheshm, who's an analyst based in Iran, and Mr. Glenn Carle, who's a former intelligence officer, joins us from Boston in the United States. Mr. Khoshcheshm, I was just looking at reports coming out of Iran, where President Rouhani is stated to have said that he's not particularly optimistic about talks, or talks can result in anything substantial. So he said, and I quote from what's been reported, he said, instead we are planning based on the assumption that we will not achieve results. Our budget for this year and next, our ministries are also acting on this basis. We are acting and going step by step with long-term prudence. So what are we looking at? Because the Europeans have not really been able to make the instincts work. So is the deal all but dead?
As a matter of fact, when he was talking about the Europeans, he was sending the signal that Iran is very much serious about continuing its present strategy that is based on reciprocal costs on the other parties, especially the Europeans and Americans, sending them the signal that any kind of inaction with regard to the JCPOA undertakings that they have, or assisting the U.S. With its hostile actions against Iran, would have repercussions and would be reciprocated with costs. These costs now are within the framework of JCPOA undertakings that Iran is modifying, and it's very much resolved to continue the same path. We've been witnessing that this new strategy that started more than 2 months ago has given the Europeans at least some impetus to make some moves. Since earlier than that, when Iran was showing tolerance, they never made the move, and they were just uttering political support for the JCPOA and doing nothing. And of course, right now, they have not accomplished anything major already, but at least they are trying to, make some moves to stop the present course that is towards further escalation in the region, especially between the United States and Iran. So if the Europeans, I'm not sure if they are unable to or they are unwilling to, because there is a long list of state companies in Europe that could have done business with Iran, and they have still been defying their undertakings, and they have not been doing business with Iran. Either way, if they don't make a move, Iran would take the 3rd and 4th step within the JCPOA, and it's clear after that the JCPOA would be gone. But this doesn't mean that Iran's instruments are just confined to the JCPOA and abrogation of the nuclear deal. After that, there will be many more moves that Iran could potentially make in various military and non-military areas. This doesn't mean war, of course, but Iran has lots of options to bother the Europeans and Americans.
Okay. Mr. Carle, as Mr. Khoshcheshm is saying, Iran has its options, but so does the United States. And on Wednesday, the Trump administration imposed sanctions on the Iranian Foreign Minister, Mr. Javad Zarif, which is more than just a metaphoric development. Of course, Iran has poo-pooed those sanctions. In fact, President Rouhani has described them as childish behavior, his exact words. What's your take on where the situation stands?
Well, it would be nice if I could say, or if anybody could say, that the United States had a clear strategy towards Iran, but that is not the case. The tactical moves are, I suppose, arguably coherent. If one says that the objective is to raise pressure on Iran, that has occurred. The sanctions bite. The military moves increase potential military actions by the United States. But to what end? The United States, because of Donald Trump, has left the JPCOA, which was an historic positive development, a rare long-term achievement in international diplomacy, with the objective of no one really knows if the United States seeks to destroy the Iranian regime or simply to renegotiate the treaty. And Trump has been making noises that a solution for him sounds a lot like the JPCOA was. So short term, the tensions certainly are alarming. Long term, we don't know, as our colleague on the air just said, but to get any direction, to get someplace, you have to know where you're trying to go. And the United States policies, frankly, are strategically incoherent unless the United States seeks regime change, which would mean war, with incalculable consequences for virtually the entire world. It's an incoherent approach, frankly, by the United States. And let's take one smaller example, one little piece in this. You mentioned the sanctions the United States has just imposed on the Iranian Foreign Minister. To what purpose is that? I'm not particularly a friend of Iran, but I would like American policies to have some tactical and strategic coherence that is, at least one can imagine, achievable. And insulting the foreign minister in a way that apparently doesn't materially bite is, I don't understand what purpose that would be.
Okay, so I've had the occasion on the program to speak with some American analysts, a couple of them former administration officials who've served at the DOD and also at the State Department. And their argument was that the Trump administration walked out of the JCPOA because it wasn't just focusing on the JCPOA. It was looking at and continues to look at Iran from a broader perspective, i.e., of course, its strategic sort of approach, and of course there's also the Israeli factor. And sort of Iran's perceived projection of power. So it's all about politique in terms of how Iran is trying to make sort of ingress into the greater Middle East and the Iranian proxies and all that. So this is the kind of analysis that I have come across. And those analysts actually try and sort of say, even when they are skeptical about the overall direction of the policy, they say that there is some method to this madness. Would you agree with that assessment?
Well, I think that gets it half right, but fundamentally wrong. As I was careful to say, I'm not a particular friend of Iran. And if Iran does take steps that the United States thinks it should oppose in any number of areas, economic, political, whether we're talking about Yemen or Iraq or Syria or Lebanon, or with respect to Israel, on and on, the United States should oppose them. That's straightforward. However, one has to exercise some judgment as to what is fundamentally important and what is more important than other objectives. Avoiding the likely destabilization that it would occur were Iran to obtain nuclear weapons probably, and I believe that it does, outweighs most other considerations with respect to Iran's actions. Now, President Obama and proponents of the JPCOA, I think, were pretty clear. Certainly I was clear in my understanding that pursuing the JPCOA and then maintaining it, we'll say, in no way affects actions that Iran is taking or the United States should take with respect to Iran's actions in Yemen, Syria, etc. If we think that we should hinder Iran's support for Hezbollah or Iran's support for the Houthis, then the United States should. But you don't damage or destroy what is a strategic success and benefit to the United States in this case, and the region and the world because of other problems. That just simply is not showing very good critical thinking.
That's an insightful question. Mr. Khoshcheshm, I said that the U.S. has also put sanctions on the Iranian Foreign Minister. Mr. Zarif obviously tweeted saying that he has no property, no interests outside of Iran, so it doesn't matter to him, if the United States slaps sanctions on him. But what could be? Is it more symbolic of the approach? Because in terms of substance, it doesn't matter much if Mr. Zarif is under sanctions.
Yes, that's right. As a matter of fact, it's no secret to anyone that this specific sanction on the Iranian foreign minister would not achieve any geopolitical, economic, or political achievement. And it's, though, very much interesting because it's very much expressing and very much revealing, because it shows that the U.S. is now empty-handed, as it has failed to identify any other sector, economic sector or security sector, to place sanctions on. And it's been left with choices such as sanctioning the Iranian foreign minister or the late founder of the Islamic Republic, Imam Khomeini, who passed away several decades ago, actually. Also re-sanctioning and placing sanctions on the commanders of the IRGC several times at a time when they have placed them under the CAATSA sanctions. That's a wide and complicated network of sanctions with many more repercussions. They have placed, easier sanctions, I could say, on the same guys, on the same commanders of the IRGC. These are all showing that the U.S. feels now empty-handed, has nothing more to sanction and to pressure Tehran. On the other side, on the opposite side, they have been showing a number of facts. I mean, they show that their maximum pressure strategy has failed to push Tehran to the negotiating table, and now they are discouraged from any kind of negotiation with the Islamic Republic. That's why they have placed the sanctions on Iranian chief diplomat, who worked out the most important deal. So
you're basically saying, if I've understood you correctly, that after and these are like all the primary and secondary sanctions. So finally, the U.S. strategy or objective has kind of gone into a cul-de-sac. There's no more opening further. There's no possibility of pressuring Iran any further. So this policy has reached its end.
Well, let me explain this. This policy, this move that they've made against Mr. Zarif, it has some repercussions because they have placed him under sanctions in connection with his cooperation with the Iranian Supreme Leader and IRGC. That means they are forcing Zarif and supporters of the nuclear deal further to the camp of the critics of the JCPOA. That means they have reduced the agenda that a nation like Iran could have for a confrontation with the United States, the different agendas and options that they might have. They have reduced all these options to one single agenda and option. That's resistance, especially knowing that the U.S. maximum pressure through the sanctions has come to its height and the peak, and this would continue maximum for a number of months, for a few more months, maybe by September or October. And then little by little, Iran would prove to be coping with these pressures, and the level of the pressures would lower, and then the U.S. would be discouraged from, opening a way through their maximum sanctions, as well as the military threat to force Tehran to the negotiating table. Therefore, once they are discouraged, they would go for a shift in their policy. It's just there that Donald Trump might start some maneuverings. Maybe he would offer Bolton as a card for a deal. Maybe he would offer some good, and charming proposals, like removing him and removing a number of sanctions for a period of 1 year in order to have Tehran at the negotiating table. They know that if they don't do so, after about 7 to 9 months from now, when this efficiency period of the sanctions eventually comes to an end and the efficiency goes down, then they would lose this only weapon that they have worked out throughout the last 15 years against Iran in order to push Tehran to the negotiating table. All other options have failed to make a breakthrough against Tehran, including inciting velvet revolutions, disobedience, cyber attacks, foreign currency meddling, and as well as security threats, threats of military action, and so on and so forth. The only strategy that could bring him some results was the engagement for the sake of containment strategy that relies much on sanctions and posing a credible military threat in order to change the calculations in Tehran, force him to the negotiating table. Now, this has an expiry date. If they come to achieve no result by then they would lose this weapon. And I believe American experts, especially sanctions experts, are very much worried about that expiry date and
They're worried about the expiry date. I'm afraid this is all I have for a U.S.-Iran discussion. Thank you so much, Mostafa Khoshcheshm, for giving us your insights. Let's go back to where we began, the Thucydides trap. As I said, with the U.S. as the existing power, dominant superpower, and China as a rising power. Can the trap be avoided? Mr. Carle, the trade war is already going on. There are lots of other tensions in the South China Sea. There's, when we look at the Chinese defense paper, the latest one, it warns the U.S. and its allies from operating in China's near abroad. When we look at the U.S. national security strategy, we realize that the U.S. is obviously looking at China as the putative contestant against the U.S. power. So where is the situation headed?
Well, Allison's book is a cautionary series of tales, certainly, and the lessons of history are disturbing for anyone who will pay attention to them. But I'm not a determinist, and I don't think history is written in advance either. Kissinger, former Secretary of State Kissinger, has made the point eloquently in a couple of books he's written on China that address this issue, in which he says the way that the world, China and the United States, can succeed in managing China's rise to avoid a great power war, frankly, will depend on the wisdom of specific leaders. Xi Jinping is showing alarming signs of being a classic son of Maoists. and totalitarian. He's not just an authoritarian, which makes the situation that much more brittle. The United States has a capricious and incompetent leader who sees China's rise from an isolationist and nationalist perspective, and doesn't know how to use the levers of power except as a blunt instrument. Although he is an isolationist and seems to want to avoid war, a hopeful point in an ironic sense in regard to our last discussion with Iran and the United States. So where do I see it going? China's rise is inevitable unless, even if the current government were to fall and be replaced by a different one. There would be a period of turmoil, but you can't change physics, basically. And 1/4 of the world's population, which is dynamic, is not going to be denied its role as the major power in the world. So this will take measure on both sides over a period of decades, and there's no guarantee either way. The slightest error by a subaltern in the Persian Gulf or in the South China Sea can lead to war, as we know has happened over and over and over again. So the future is unclear except China's rise. The wise approach on both parties would be for the United States, on the whole, the United States has been pursuing for years, decades, to accommodate to the rise of China. And on China's part, not to be an aggressive rising power that carries its resentments rather than pride in its growing achievements.
Yes, I agree with you, but here's the problem. Once you are powerful, then it's a matter of time before you have your own version of the Monroe Doctrine. And when you do that, China's going to do that in the East China Sea or the South China Sea, then obviously these are areas where the US has also been projecting power for a very long time for its own core interests as well as the interests of its allies in the region. I'm also joined by Joseph Cheng, who's an analyst based in Hong Kong. Mr. Cheng, before you joined us, we were talking about the rising tension on a number of issues between the US and China. And while obviously the two are not going to go to war immediately, the fact is that, I discussed that the structural realists obviously say that there is potential for conflict always between an existing power and a rising power. But we also talked about the Thucydides trap and the fact whether that trap can be avoided. Now, there's not a shooting war going on, but there's a lot of aggressive patrolling by China in the South China Sea and also by the US. And of course, the trade war is going on. So where do you think the situation stands?
I don't think China is interested in a military conflict with the United States. I do believe that China will try to avoid any military confrontation with the United States now that Sino-American trade negotiations are going on. Although apparently progress is very little, it has made very little progress so far. At the moment, I think China understands that basically it would like to maintain good relations with Iran, and in the intermediate and long-term future, it certainly wants to protect its investment in Iran and to maintain Iran as an oil supplier. Since it has no intention to confront the United States, it will probably stop importing oil from Iran for the time being. In fact, oil imports from Iran dropped by almost 60%.
Mr. Cheng, Iran is kind of ancillary to this. I'm more interested in looking at the situation as it is developing, A, on the trade war side, and secondly, in the South China Sea, because there are aggressive gestures that we see in the waters from both sides. Now, Secretary of State Pompeo, he said in Thailand, he talked about the Chinese coercion of Southeast Asian neighbors. He also mentioned the disputes over the South China Sea, as I said, and China's dam building on the Mekong River. So there are a number of issues that he talked about, and this was sort of post-meeting his Chinese counterpart.
Yes. Again, with regard to the South China Sea, although there are aggressive gestures on both sides, as you said, probably more on the part of the United States rather than China, at the same time, you may notice that both countries have been quite eager to establish all types of confidence-building measures at the military level as well as at the foreign ministry level. Certainly, both sides understand that gestures may well be needed to satisfy its allies in the region or to satisfy the domestic audiences, but I'm sure that these two major powers have no intention to go to war, and at the same time, they also want to avoid any incidents, actually, which may lead to embarrassing military conflicts. At the same time, you notice that in the recent weeks, the Donald Trump administration has avoided any provocations of China, either on the Taiwan issue nor on the Hong Kong issue.
Yeah, in fact, President Trump talked about the fact that Hong Kong protests, the riots, are an issue that China, which is China's own thing to deal with. So yes, you were right. I mean, there are those gestures also, and I think better sense will prevail. Thank you so much, Mr. Glenn Carle, Mr. Joseph Cheng, for speaking with us. We shall take a short break and return to discuss unsavory developments in neighboring India, including rising religious intolerance. Stay with us. Welcome back to Indus Special. India's Supreme Court on Thursday moved the rape trial of a powerful regional politician to New Delhi to allay fears that the accused politician could influence the outcome. It's a sordid story. A young woman accused Kuldeep Singh Sanghar, a Bharatiya Janata Party legislator from northern Uttar Pradesh state. A few days ago, a truck conveniently broadsided the car in which the woman was traveling. She's been fighting for her life since then, while relatives say the accident was no accident, and since the case was filed against Sanghar, the family has been threatened by the legislators, relatives, and associates. The police have registered a case against Sanghar. Meanwhile, in the southern state of Madhya Pradesh, a man cancelled his order because he was assigned a non-Hindu delivery executive by a food ordering service, Zomato. His tweet has triggered a nationwide debate over religious intolerance. Police has already warned the man to stay away from social media and not put out anything that could lead to public unrest. Let's open the discussion on the broader implication of these events, for which we are joined by Vidya Subramaniam, who's a former executive editor, The Hindu, and based in Delhi. Asad Rahim Khan, who is a lawyer, joins us in Lahore, and Rajesh Sundaram, who is a journalist also based in Delhi. Mr. Sundaram, give me a sense of the Uttar Pradesh state is governed by the BJP. There is a former monk, or is he still a monk, Yogi Adityanath, whom I'm assuming is a religious person. And one would assume that he would have a sort of moral normative approach towards law and order. One of his own legislators has been accused of this. So is this something which is usual, or is this one of those one-off things?
Well, I think it has history. This entire episode in India's caste feudal issues, and also this is not something that's particularly this thing of India or of Uttar Pradesh. It's spread across the subcontinent. If you will see how it happens. You have the police force, which is subservient to the government. It has its own independence, if you see as per the constitution. But they know that their transfers and postings are dependent on the government of the day, and they would follow what their political masters are ordering. And the political masters, especially if the criminals get them votes, if they are the caste that is significant for them, tend to have a different set of laws for them. And I wouldn't say that this is something that's particular to the BJP. We've had previous governments in other states which are run by other parties, and exactly the same thing has happened. Here, of course, this is something that has caused a lot of outrage in India, especially in the social media and the common people, where we have a party like the BJP, which calls itself a party that is different, that's a party of change, indulging in the same nonsense which the other parties have been doing, which has been perpetrated for so many decades, post-independence, even before independence. So clearly, this is something that's not acceptable to civil society. This is something which the Supreme Court has called out and has given taken a few measures, although a little too late for the victim, if I can add. But those are things that clearly are not acceptable, that goes against the set standards and practices and laws in India, and clearly are not something that Indians as a larger civil society is proud of.
Right. Ms. Subramaniam, what Ms. Sundaram is saying, that this is something that we have seen, and this is unfortunately a kind of South Asian phenomenon, but that various parties and their legislators have been found doing things which are not exactly legal. But in the case of the BJP, the general approach of the party has been that they're trying to create, and I don't want to use this term because we use it in Pakistan, but a sort of new India. So one would assume that in a new India, the BJP legislators would act differently from other legislators from other parties.
Well, the term "new" has unfortunately become something to be frightened about, because this is actually, I somewhat differ from the other gentlemen. See, there's a pattern here. If you go back to, it goes back to the previous term of Mr. Modi, and the pattern is that the rapes, etc., are one kind, but we've also had a lot of violence, violence that has been perpetrated by the cadre, and in the name of the cow, there's been a lot of violence, been mob lynching of Muslims especially. And what has happened is that in each of these cases, there's so much impunity that all the lynchings are recorded, tape recorded. So you can imagine that how fearless these mobs are, that they're able to record these, the horrible deaths that take place on camera, even as they're being, as young and old, whoever is being lynched. They put them out, and then what happens is that initially this is followed by silence. And after some time, after there's a lot of outrage on the social media, and that outrage is also a very small outrage, because there is a counter outrage which kind of questions this outrage. You know what I mean? So the counter outrage being of people of majoritarian persuasion, they will try to defend all this and say, didn't this happen in your time? Didn't this happen in that time? And a lot of whataboutery. So as a result, finally, the establishment, the Prime Minister or the government will say something to the effect that this should not happen, and I take a very serious view of this, and so on and so forth. And then again, this incident happens, and then the worst thing is, the reason why these people draw so much power from is that a lot of the legislators themselves, come out and give these kind of statements. So what happens? So the impunity is drawn from the fact that the establishment itself supports this kind of behavior. So in this case, we've had another rape incident of a very young child in Kathua, and there BJP, there's a whole delegate that took out processions in support of the accused. So, and these were all BJP men. This is something unique. This hasn't happened before. I mean, I agree that rapes and violence against women, all this happens in other states too, and other parties too do it. We have a party, the Samajwadi Party, where the chief of the party said boys will be boys, and some rape accusation came up. But we never had the establishment supporting this.
That's a very important. That's a very important. Let me take that to Asad Rahim Khan. Asad, India does have a rape problem. Mr. Sundaram is right. I mean, these power relations. And, you see this in the rural areas. But this is also an urban phenomenon. I mean, we saw what happened in Delhi and in other cities in India. As Ms. Subramaniam was saying, that this is the first time that you see the administration actually supporting people who were accused of these heinous crimes. So what's your, I mean, you deal with these things, you observe these things here also. What's your take on this?
Well, I find it frankly surprising. Thank you, Ejaz Sahab, for having me with regards to the contention that this happens across all countries in the subcontinent, it happens in other states, it happens under other political parties. I think we need to be cognizant of the social project that is going on in India and the immediate realities that inform it. Uttar Pradesh is the most populous state in India. It also has the highest Muslim population in the country. The imposition of Mr. Yogi Adityanath as Chief Minister is not a coincidence. And I think it's an interesting prejudice of the Hindutva nationalist mindset that the social norms that they inflict on, let's say, Muslims or Dalits, will not also then carry on to other segments that lack social protections, whether that's women, whether that's children, whether that's Christians, and so on and so forth. As far as this incident is concerned, we have seen the trends, we've seen the writing on the wall. This person was assaulted when she was 16. And the legislator that we are speaking about immediately said that he would offer her a job afterwards. The protection that was afforded to her mysteriously vanished the day of the truck that rammed into her lawyer's vehicle and her aunt's vehicle. She is in critical condition. And if we take a step back and think that the provincial apparatus or the state apparatus is not involved, I think one of the most shocking incidents, or rather most shocking observations to come out of this entire case is that the charge sheet against the legislator, Mr. Sangar, has actually not been assigned a court yet, for which reason the Supreme Court has now assigned all of these cases out of UP to be adjudicated in another jurisdiction. So this is a BJP-led statist project. It is carrying over onto other segments, and if the tide is not reversed soon, we are, I think, in the throes of a majoritarian state that has a very close relationship with patriarchy as well.
Mr. Sundaram, what would you say to what Mr. Asad Rahim Khan is saying?
Well, I'll find it very difficult to dispute what he's saying this, because I think one of the biggest threats that we have in this country today is the threat of majoritarianism, because we've had a liberal society, a democracy. And I think for any democracy, when you have certain tendencies, for want of any other word, fascist tendencies coming in, and also this majoritarianism and an overwhelming sense that the minorities get, not just the religious minorities, but both within, the lower castes, the so-called lower castes as well, the sense of insecurity is something that the founding fathers of India's constitution wanted to avoid. And their worst fears are coming through with what we see with the majoritarian stands that many of the parties are taking. Because, and also there is a fear that, once issues like the economic crisis that some economists are talking about in India plays out, and the social consequences of that come out, perhaps the political parties, especially the BJP, would push on this majoritarian agenda to garner votes and keep their voters together and take their minds away from the financial and economic woes that are happening. These are very real fears that there are there right now. But of course, like I said earlier, this is something that the right-thinking people of India, and I clearly feel they are in majority, will be against. This is something that goes against, the principles and what India stands for. And there will be within civil society a substantial number of people who will stand up for this. And we are already seeing that to a large extent. This kind of a majoritarianism is not what the core of India is. India is
Okay,
diverse.
right. But Ms. Subramaniam, if accept what Mr. Sundaram is saying, and I do hope that he's right, but if I were to look at the head count in Lok Sabha and how many seats the BJP has got, thumping majority, bettering even its result in 2014, then I'm not sure if the right-minded people are in the majority in India. Would you agree with me?
Well, certainly, no way that I can disagree with you on that. But the saddest part today in India is that we virtually have no opposition. This is so scary because we expect the opposition to stand up and protest. So what we now have instead is that even when critical bills are passed in Parliament, the opposition walks out. It's very mysterious. Where they could have prevented such bills from being passed, they just walk out. So that's one thing. So this leaves any kind of protest and outrage to a very small section of civil society, which is really powerless because the minute you protest, you're called urban naxal, or you're called terrorist sympathizers, or you're called various other names, So there's a very shrinking space for liberal thinking. So unless it starts hurting people individually, it starts hurting people in other forms, I think it's going to be very difficult to get out of this.
These are little indicators. For instance, I was talking about this Zomato user who said that you assigned me a non-Hindu delivery executive. Now, India is a huge country, and it's not a monolith. It has so many languages, ethnicities, religions, various denominations. So, given that diversity, the only way it can stay together is to have some kind of code or a constitutional or a normative acceptance of the fact that diversity has to be accepted. Otherwise, it's just not going to work. So now this kind of project that you also talked about, and Ms. Sundaram agrees with you, Ms. Subramaniam is already saying that there's virtually no opposition. It's kind of scary. And since we are in the neighborhood, I'm really scared.
Well, I think as far as the Zomato incident is concerned, the Indian media should be playing this up a lot more for the right reasons, in that the police took action and they sent a notice to the offender and said that do not do anything that is inflammatory. What I find very fascinating, Ejaz Saab, is that this is also the lowest hanging fruit. The police tend to enter in and tell this one random gentleman who tweeted something abrasive on Twitter that you are not to do this again. I didn't see the same state interference either in the cow lynchings, either in the beef cases, either in these rape cases, either in any cases which involve senior BJP legislators, but where a gentleman tweets something under 280 characters, it is considered something where the writ of the state is enforceable. The other interesting point about the opposition is where I think we can draw a direct comparison to Pakistan. The left wing here and the left wing over there has a tendency to fetishize political leaders whose sole achievement in life is being born. Rahul Gandhi is not going to help India break the impasse that this muscular Hindutva project has brought. Now, similarly here, when you look at the same dynasties that have been continuing since at least 1968, I don't see new or innovative solutions either. So, as far as India is concerned, we are looking at a government that I say, and I'm afraid of saying, is going to grow more and more muscular, more and more assertive, and more popular. It's no coincidence, sir, and I'll bring you back to the UP state. For the first time in history, first time since independence, in 2014, UP did not return a single Muslim legislator. In 2019, those same Muslims had completely become liabilities for the electoral process. So if you won't vote for BJP, will you vote for Samajwadi in UP who also facilitated Muslim riots? Will you vote for Congress where Rahul Gandhi is trying to paint himself in even brighter saffron colors? So I think that spectrum needs to be revitalized for the same reasons that you mentioned in the beginning if India is to remain a messy, noisy, pluralistic democracy.
Absolutely. I also have to wrap up, but very quickly, Mr. Sundaram, would you agree with what Mr. Khan is saying?
Well, as far as the Zomato incident is concerned, it's seen a lot of outrage, I think, across the spectrum of.
No, but as Mr. Khan said, this was also the low-hanging fruit because that's where the police got in. But there's so many other incidents where the
law and order in India is a state subject, so it depends on which state you are. If it's a Congress-governed state, perhaps there will be sterner action. If it's a BJP-governed state, they'll look the other way. Madhya Pradesh is a Congress state at the current time, so you'll have to keep that in mind as well.
Okay.
But clearly, but I think you should also keep in mind that perhaps this is a phase that the country is going through. Once we have mounting financial woes or the economy comes under stress, perhaps the voters will look the other way. We'll have to consider that.
Okay, I have to quickly go back to Ms. Subramaniam before I wrap up. Ms. Subramaniam, is this just a phase, a moment, or is it likely to become an episode?
So this has been going on since 2014. Ideally, after 5 years of this kind of governance, we should have seen either a change or a reduced majority, neither of which has happened. Instead, we have a government which has got a bigger majority, which is taken as an endorsement of everything that has happened on the
That's what Asad Rahim Khan is pointing at. Yeah, that's what Asad is pointing at. Thank you so much. I'm afraid this is all the time I have. Thank you, Ms. Vidya Subramaniam, Asad Rahim Khan, Rajesh, Sundaram. We shall see you next week. Until then, it's goodbye.